thank you so much for having me this evening. And I'm going to talk about mangroves specifically in Pinellas County, but I'll be providing some general information about mangroves as well. And as many people probably know, mangroves are considered a bridge between the land and the sea. And they're basically a very important habitat between the transition from uplands to tidal areas. And mangroves are salt tolerant. They're tropical trees that grow in calm intertidal areas where the temperature typically does not fall below freezing for any extended period of time. They tend to be very cold sensitive, and they are subject to freezing when temperatures do drop. In the Tampa Bay area, we have 3 species of mangroves which are present. We have black mangroves, Avicennia germanis is the Latin name. We also have red mangroves, Rhizophora mangel, and white mangroves, Langularia racemosa. And all 3 species are present throughout most of Pinellas County. And each of them do have some unique adaptations for survival in the salt water. They are salt tolerant as opposed to being totally adapted to salt. So they do have to have specialized ways to remove salt from their system. For example, the red mangrove, they have prop roots as seen in this photo here. And these roots grow down from the trunks and the branches. They're aerial prop roots, and they'll grow into the substrate. And this allows them to catch sediments and filter water and provide benefits. They're also known as the walking tree, which was the nickname that they've been given because they do appear to be walking on water. And they're usually the first ones to recruit onto islands. And these trap the sediments, and that allows the islands to build. The leaf shape is elliptic, and it's pretty much evenly colored on the top and the bottom, a medium shade of green. And that the little propagules, which are these leaf structures that are present, they develop on the tree, and they'll actually continue to grow on the tree until they are ready to sprout and fall. They'll then drop into the water, and they tend to float horizontally throughout the water. And once they're at a point where they're ready to root, they'll turn into a vertical position and just float around until they bump into something that allows them to drop into the sediment and root. The other thing about the red mangrove, sorry, was that they do exclude 97% of the salt from their system, and the remainder they extract through their leaves. Now, the black mangroves also have a special adaptation to removing salt from their system, and they use these pneumatophores, which are these little finger-like projections that grow around the trunk in the mud, and they tend to be used for air exchange. And they are also able to pull the salt out of the out of their system and pump it out through their leaves. So oftentimes you can find a layer of salt on their leaves, and indigenous people had used the salt from these leaves as a seasoning in previous times. Again, these have an elliptic shaped leaf similar to a red mangrove, slightly more rounded, but it is darker green on the surface, and it has a silvery or whitish underside. And that's one of the distinctive characteristics of this particular variety. Then the third variety is the white mangrove, which has a different leaf shape than the other 2. And this has a rounded paddle-shaped leaf, which is a medium shade of green and leathery, and it's green on both sides. It does have this unique feature of these little nodules that are at the base of the leaf, and those nodules are used to extract the salt from the plant, and that does help them to be able to live in the environment that they're in, with inundated with salt water. So we do have another species of wetland plant that is very closely related to mangroves, which is, it typically grows along the shoreline on the higher range just above where the other three species of mangroves grow. It's not protected by our mangrove code, but it does grow in a similar habitat. And this is our buttonwood, which is Conocarpus erectus. And this does as well have a smaller elliptic shaped leaf as the red and black mangrove, but it has very unique rounded little fruit-like structures that look like small little puffs, and they turn kind of hard as they get pass on in their season. And these fruits are the reproductive body for this tree. And it is a wetland species, so it is protected under a wetland code, just not the Pinellas County Mangrove Trimming Ordinance. It also comes in two color variations, the green, which is in the photo above, and then the silver, which is a cultivar that is very commonly used in coastal communities for plantings where there is the possibility of salt spray or some kind of salt influences. So typically mangroves will have a preferred area of growth, and they don't always follow the rules, but the red mangroves tend to be found in deeper water as their prop roots are more structured for this type of location. They are all within the intertidal zone, which is located between the mean low water and the mean high water lines. And the prop roots of the red mangroves do allow for them to have their feet wet and stay in deeper waters and be able to adequately adhere to the substrate. And as I mentioned earlier, they do collect sediments and trap that sediment and help build up shorelines and stabilize the shoreline. In slightly shallower water, we would find our black mangroves. And because of the pneumatophores, that helps with the oxygen exchange so that they're able to also tolerate having their feet wet and be able to thrive in that particular environment. White mangroves don't have any specific trunk or root adaptations that would allow them to stand with their feet wet, so they typically would be in areas where the periodic inundation is, limited, and they tend to like being a little bit higher and drier where they're not constantly having their roots wet. And then buttonwood really don't like having their roots inundated with tidal waters, but they will tolerate some salt spray, so they're located just on the upland of these other mangrove species. Now, the order can sometimes be different, but for the most part, this is the preferred way that they would be growing under those types of circumstances due to their adaptations. So mangroves are also considered a keystone species, and that is defined as a species that has other species in an ecosystem that heavily rely upon it. And if it were removed from the ecosystem, that would cause dramatic changes to that ecosystem. And mangroves are a base for the entire estuarine system and community, and they basically provide habitat, food sources, shelter, and in many different species are dependent on them. There is a total of approximately 1,300 species that are dependent on the mangroves for some portion of their life cycle. There are other examples that also are keystone species, and these would be, for example, the longleaf pine that would support red-cockaded woodpeckers and indigo snakes, and a bald cypress, the ivory-billed woodpecker, and the gopher tortoise burrows would support other um, wildlife that would share the burrows, like gopher frogs and things of that nature. And those are different examples of additional keystone species that can be located within the state. Now, as I mentioned, there's a wide variety of species that depend on mangroves for some portion of their life cycle. And, these are these, from micro to macro algae, extending all the way to mammals and everything pretty much in between that you can find having some kind of interaction with the coastal communities. The crustaceans typically find food matter from the decaying leaf material and detritus that you can find at the base of the mangroves. And there's also other crabs that, like the mangrove crab, for example, that eat the leaves, and that also contributes to some of that leaf drop. Then we see a variety of reptiles, such as snakes, that are prevalent in the mangrove systems, including mangrove snakes, rat snakes, um, banded water snakes, and cottonmouths are some of the more popular species that we'll see as regulars within the mangrove community. Then we'll also see mammals that'll come in and forage for food, such as raccoons and possums, and some other larger mammals occasionally will frequent the area. And they look for any kind of crustaceans and um, other algae and or various vegetative matter that they would consume, as well as the invertebrates and crustaceans that are a main part of their diet. And the mangrove root system, particularly of the red mangroves, does provide a very suitable habitat for fish nursery, juvenile fish nursery situations where there's protection from a lot of predators, and there's viable food sources available for the initial phases of the development of these fish species. Particularly, we see some of the recreation fish, such as snook and red drum, tarpon, spotted trout, and redfish as some very common species that you'll find within the mangrove systems, at least during the juvenile portion of their life cycle before they go out to open waters. The mangroves do provide about over 80% of the marine species in the commercial and recreation areas are dependent on these mangrove systems for some portion of their life cycle, as I mentioned, and they're very dependent to have prevalent recreation fisheries out there in the deeper waters. Also, we have breeding, nesting, and sheltering and roosting for many different shorebirds that are provided by the mangrove systems. The upper canopy is ideal for nesting and roosting habitat, and some of the bird species also search for food around the root systems, where they'll find crustaceans and other food sources that are prevalently available. Mangroves can also provide very suitable nesting habitat, as in the photo here for some green herons, one of the species that does frequent the mangrove system. Herons, egrets, spoonbills, pelicans, and some osprey and other birds of prey are very readily located within the mangrove systems, and they do utilize them regularly for food sources as well as foraging and nesting. Now, in addition to those particular um, habitat um, benefits that we have from mangroves, we do have some additional benefits that they provide on a larger scale. They do filter runoff from the upland, and they do trap sediments in their root systems. And that is helpful in improving water quality and preventing pollutants from entering the waters. It also is an excellent source of protection from flooding, sea level rise, storm surge, and things of that nature. The trunks and root systems create a very substantial barrier that does provide some stability and support that does help against those types of circumstances, particularly in areas that do have storms and potential for storm surge. Also, there is a reduction in the carbon dioxide that is captured by the photosynthesis of the trees. And again, it does support the fishing and recreational resources by being a habitat for those species. So in this illustration, we have just a representation of all different types of animals that are dependent on mangroves, and everything from small marine worms and crustaceans all the way up to diamondback terrapins and mangrove snakes, as I mentioned earlier, varying types of snails, and some of the different birds like brown pelicans, and even some upland birds will utilize mangroves along with the different fish species. And mangroves do provide a socioeconomic value as well. They do provide numerous recreational opportunities, and it's a very good source of ecotourism to be able to either paddle through the mangrove forests, where they have some cut ditches through those where you can actually be immersed within the mangrove system, or boat tours that bring you in and around mangrove islands, and then the commercial opportunities for the fisheries and the fishing benefit that would be reaped by the fish populations that are plentiful. So now moving over to our regulation of mangroves and the legislative intent for mangrove protection. Basically, it would be from unregulated removal or destruction of mangroves. And this is something that was initially a state code, and we now have the delegation in Pinellas County for protecting mangroves within Pinellas County. So they also protect uninhabited mangrove islands and any lands that are set aside for conservation as well as preservation. It is to provide waterfront property owners a right to their riparian view, and also to encourage property owners to plant and maintain mangroves along their shoreline to create some viable habitat in areas where there may not be that habitat available. Now, there's a fairly lengthy history of mangrove trimming in Pinellas County, and this started in the 70s when Pinellas County started regulating mangrove trimming through the county tree ordinance. This was initially addressed through our code enforcement department, and that developed into the Habitat Management and Landscape Code in 1990, and that allowed a little bit more in-depth regulation of trees as well as mangroves. Then in 1995, the state had decided that they were going to eliminate all of the local controls over mangrove trimming or alteration. And that's when they implemented the State Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. And at that point, no other state codes or city codes were allowed unless they were in compliance with the state, this new state act. And in 1996, the Pinellas County took on the delegation from the state, and we felt that we could do a better job regulating mangrove trimming within our county based on our resources and the exposure that we had to the coastline, and a little bit more staffing than the state had for that available to us. And then also in 1996, that Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act was amended. And from there, in 2003, the Board of County Commissioners adopted the County Code, which became the Pinellas County Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Code. And that's the current code that we work under for all mangrove trimming and preservation within Pinellas County. And most of this code outlines exempt trimming, and this was what was the majority of what was covered in the state act. And it does give us additional oversight to different aspects of trimming, such as having more control over the professional mangrove trimmers that do the trimming, making some additional requirements for them to be registered with the county. So we do have some regulatory oversight there. And basically any county that does take delegation, they can't be any more lenient than the state code, but they do have the opportunity to be a little stricter if they choose to be. So to just clarify, the shoreline is basically a defining line between any upland areas and any tidal or other water bodies that are protected or lost my train of thought, sorry. Wetlands or other surface waters, that was the other term I was looking for, sorry. So basically the shoreline is kind of a defining line between the upland and the jurisdictional areas of wetlands and other other surface waters. Now our code defines mangroves as the 3 species I mentioned earlier, which is the Rhizophora mangle, the Avicennia germans, the red mangrove, the black mangrove, and then white mangrove, the Lancularia racemosa. And the code also protects both the living and the dead mangroves because they do provide habitat value even if they are dead mangroves for roosting purposes and things of that nature. So to look at the definitions of trimming versus alteration. So trimming is basically cutting branches, twigs, leaves, anything of that nature without defoliation or alteration. So basically anything that is going to be trimmed is going to leave the plant with adequate foliage so that it will be sustainable. And that can be done in a few different ways, which I'll go into in a few minutes here. Versus alteration, as shown here in this other illustration, which is basically anything other than trimming. And oftentimes alteration will result in effective removal of mangroves, as it does remove the greenery in many instances that effectively kills the trees.
Carol, can I ask a question?
Certainly.
Going back to that photo.
Okay, let me back up here.
So the mangroves are the lower, the green shrubs on the bottom there that look like they've been trimmed like boxwood?
All of it is mangroves. These are smaller mangroves which are trimmed to no less than 6 feet in height. And this is one type of trimming that occurs, which is basically like a hedge type of trimming that we do allow. And then these taller trees are black mangroves. And oftentimes they grow more tree-like, so they don't have lower foliage on them in many circumstances, in which case they can't be reduced in height to that 6-foot height. So this would be considered window trimming. And the canopy is left intact, but the lateral branches are removed. And then this provides a view through here for the upland property owners.
Is there a limitation on how frequently they can trim like they're doing on the bottom there, where they're maintaining that shape?
Typically that can be done in some instances up to twice a year if it's at the very beginning of the growing season and at the very end of the growing season. But most of the time it is just once a year that they would be trimming these mangroves to maintain that configuration.
So in this photo, they had just trimmed it. That's why it looks so perfect.
I would say so, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So the general criteria for trimming is that mangroves must be located on either lands owned by the individual that is interested in doing the trimming, or they must be on state-owned submerged lands. They also need to be not in an area that would be set aside for either conservation, mitigation, or preservation. So natural areas with some kind of limitations, conservation easements, all of those would be prohibited. Excuse me. Mangroves cannot be trimmed to a height of less than 6 feet from the mudline or the substrate. No mangroves can be removed, destroyed, or defoliated, and no prop roots can be cut. There are a few exceptions to that rule, and typically that would be if they are looking to do like a replacement seawall and the mangroves are actually growing into an old seawall, then they can, through a permit, potentially cut prop roots to be able to have access to install a new wall. But outside of that, there are very few other exceptions. Additionally, mangroves that have reached a height of 16 feet or taller, they need to be trimmed in stages so that only up to 25% of the foliage can be removed annually. And that would be basically to prevent defoliation. Herbicides and chemicals are restricted and cannot be used on mangroves. And so since the majority of our code does talk about exemptions, I will provide some examples of different types of exemptions that we would see on a regular basis through our request for mangrove trimming. And an exemption can only be done if there is a riparian mangrove fringe, and that would be defined as an area from the most landward mangrove trunks to the most waterward mangrove trunks, measuring less than 50 feet. And in this particular, and this measurement is done perpendicular to the shoreline. So this would be something that would qualify for exempt trimming. The photo beneath is an area that's definitely measuring greater than 50 feet in depth, and that does not meet the qualification for exempt trimming, but it could potentially be trimmed under a permit. So another example here, we have this mangrove fringe that comes out along this property, and our shoreline is defined by this wall here. And because this mangrove fringe does not connect to that shoreline, it's not considered a riparian mangrove fringe. And even though it is less than 50 feet in depth, it would not be eligible for exempt trimming. So in this particular example, if a homeowner was interested in trimming their mangroves, and this would be the property lines extended into the waterway of what would be in front of this parcel's mangroves. So this area in question, if they wanted to trim those, they're attached to the shoreline and they would qualify for exempt trimming. However, this area here, if they were interested in trimming those, that would be considered an island and they would not be eligible to trim those because our code does not allow any kind of trimming on mangrove islands that are not attached to the shoreline. So property owners do have the option to do their own mangrove trimming under certain circumstances. And the mangroves on their property cannot be taller than 10 foot in height in the pre-trimmed condition, and they cannot be reduced to less than 6 feet. So if a property owner were interested in doing their own trimming, they would qualify for an exemption in this particular circumstance when they are less than 10 foot tall and not being trimmed below 6 foot. And another exemption is let me see, with the professional mangrove trimmer, sorry, a PMT, would be able to do the trimming authorized by a homeowner under those similar circumstances. However, mangroves could not be over 24 foot tall, cannot be reduced to 6 foot or less, and any mangroves that are 16 foot tall or taller within the trim area do need to preserve 25% or have their foliage reduced 25% and no more during the annual trimming. So if you have 14 foot tall mangroves, this could potentially, depending on the species of mangrove, be trimmed in one cutting to a lower height, probably to this closer to the 10-foot height without defoliating. However, there are some circumstances where that initial cut can be a little bit more substantial, especially if the mangroves are closer to that 10-foot height and there's no defoliation involved. But the big trick here is making sure that there's adequate foliage on the lower portion of the trees in order to make sure that there is adequate greenery once the trimming has occurred. Now, in this particular example, these mangroves are substantially taller than 16 feet, so they would have to be reduced over a number of years incrementally. And there are some trees that may not meet this criteria because they do not have adequate foliage on the lower portion of the trees. Oftentimes, this situation occurs where they can be reduced because these trees have not been trimmed at any point in time, and they do have green foliage on the lower portion. So they would be initially reduced 25% in the first cut, then another 25% the following year, and so on until they can reach that 6 foot height if they are candidates for that. But these trees cannot be over 24 feet tall to be eligible for that kind of trimming. So in this particular example, we do have a tree that's at 27 feet in height, and they had wanted to trim it down to 6 feet. And that does not meet the criteria for exempt trimming. And as you can see, the whole center portion of this tree has no foliage in it whatsoever. So it's not going to be an eligible candidate for height reduction, since they would basically be defoliating the tree, bringing it down to 6 foot. So additionally, there are some restrictions as far as the length of the shoreline and how much trimming can occur on a particular property. So if you have 150 feet of shoreline or less, then you would be eligible to trim 100% of that shoreline as long as the trees followed the exempt criteria and could be trimmed. Some of those could potentially be reduced in height, and trimmed to a hedge, and others may not be able to be trimmed to a hedge. They might have to have that window trimming as I had shown in the earlier image. Now, once you have a shoreline that's greater than 150 feet in length, then that limits the mangrove trimming area to 65%. The other 35% of the mangroves will need to remain in their natural state. So those are the situations where if the fringe depth is less than the 50 feet, then it does qualify as exempt trimming. However, they would need to carefully select their trim window because they will have to leave other mangroves on their property at their natural height. And if they are looking to gain a view, the strategic placement would be important. So if you have dock structures that have mangroves that are growing around the dock structure, right next to it, over top of it, we do have an exemption that does allow for trimming of mangroves within 8 vertical feet of the deck surface of the dock. And that would be basically more of a safety issue so that people can adequately walk on and off of these structures without injury. And then maintenance trimming, as long as it meets the specific criteria, can be done as an exemption as well. And basically that would be the riparian mangrove fringe under 24 feet. They had been trimmed in the past, but they had been legally trimmed, not something that was done illegally. And they've been maintained in that same configuration over the years without any kind of destruction, defoliation, or removal of mangroves. Now, dead mangroves also do qualify potentially as exempt trimming, but they do need to have a staff member verify that they actually have been dead, and typically that occurs from freeze damage as they are cold sensitive. So in years that we do have particularly cold winters, occasionally we do get some freeze damaged mangroves, particularly at the northern portions of the county. And there has to be a 6-month time period from the time the tree had died. And they need to be 10 feet or shorter. And they can be then reduced in height to eliminate the tree, as long as the debris and the branches have all been removed from the wetland area. And we do need to have advance notification before any kind of exempt trimming occurs on dead trees so that we can verify that they actually are in that state. Additionally, there's a few opportunities for surveyors, utility workers, or government employees to cut a swath that's not in excess of 3 feet, or to trim some mangroves in the course of their job duties to have access, particularly for maintenance or utility work, and also in order to make sure that utility services continue to be provided for customers. And that would be something that would not require permitting. It would be qualifying for exempt trimming. So as I had mentioned a little bit ago, there is a classification within our mangrove code, for professional mangrove trimmers. And these individuals do need to meet specific criteria in order to be classified as professional mangrove trimmers. They would also need to register with the county and pay a registration fee. In the first year, they would pay a $50 initial fee. And then if they would like to stay on the professional mangrove trimmers list, if they have met the adequate criteria as shown here, then they would be eligible to do that as long as they're in good standing with a $25 renewal fee. And this gives us an opportunity to make sure that they are following all the code and that they are not doing anything that would be contrary, that would cause any kind of violations or inappropriate trimming out there. And just a few of the more common criteria that people becoming professional mangrove trimmers utilize. Most of our professional mangrove trimmers are certified arborists, but we do have a number that have used the classification of professional wetland scientists or environmental professionals to be able to register with us. And there is one other criteria that the code does allow, that if they don't have the formal credentials to be able to do that, if they can illustrate that they have worked under an individual that does meet that criteria, they do have the opportunity to present us with 10 mangrove trimming projects that were properly authorized and show that they can do the appropriate trimming work under the criteria of our code. And if they've worked under an existing professional, and once they demonstrate that, then they could potentially as well qualify. That's a little bit more challenging to qualify under that criteria, but it is an option if they do not have some of the other credentials.
Carol, where would a homeowner find a list of qualified mangrove trimmers? Or does the county maintain that online?
Yes, we do have that on our website, and that would be www.Pinellas County, all spelled out one word, /environmental/mangroves. And there would be a list of professional mangrove trimmers that would be available there, and that does list everyone that's currently registered and on our list in good standing, and the entire code for mangrove trimming, as well as the brochure for, well, currently the brochure is not there, but we will have a brochure on there again. That's been taken off temporarily for ADA compliance, and that will be put back on to our website here shortly. So the other portion of the code does look at permitted trimming, and that does need to meet slightly different criteria than the exempt trimming. So for permitted trimming, we look at the larger areas of mangrove fringe and the ones that don't qualify for the exempt criteria. These would be typically 50 feet to 500 feet in depth. And again, that's measured from the most landward trunk to the most waterward trunk, perpendicular to the shoreline. These would then be allowed a maximum of 65% trimming, and 25% of the mangroves in the trimmed area that are 16 foot tall or taller will need to have their canopies left intact. The trimming can only occur in the non-winter months, which would be March 1st through November 30th. And that would be basically to minimize the possibility of freeze damage. Non-petroleum based lubricants, such as vegetable oil, are necessary in the chainsaws. And any invasive exotic species, such as Brazilian pepper, that are located within 25 feet of the mangrove area must be removed from the wetland areas. And any of the debris, branches, trunks, etc., must be removed from the wetland. So why do people have an interest in trimming mangroves? The most common reason we see is for view, because they want to have you know, if they live near the water, they want to have a view of the water. The other more common reason we see is for navigation, particularly on narrower water bodies, such as canals, where sometimes the fringes can grow into the center portions of the canal, restricting navigation. So when we do have permitted trimming, as in this particular situation, we have a number of condominiums or townhomes here. And what we like to see at these multifamily residences is that the trimming would be kind of equally distributed so that everyone does have some kind of a view from um, their buildings. It typically it is up to the applicant, and that can be, in this particular instance, like a homeowners association that would be turning in an application to do permitted trimming, or it could be a professional mangrove trimmer working on their behalf. But we do like to see something where the areas that there isn't much view that would be gained would be left as no trim areas, and then the areas in front of these buildings that have a view of the water would then become trim areas. And that typically is more fair for the residents of those types of communities to more equally distribute that view. And that seems to work much better than limited to one particular area. Then additionally, if they're looking to trim for navigation, that would be limited to no closer than the most waterward prop roots of the mangrove trees. So if in this illustration, if you have this section out here growing out over the waterway, or this area here, those could potentially be trimmed. But the prop roots here would be the limiting factor as to how close to the shoreline they could trim. And we try to minimize how much of the canopy is reduced so that it doesn't have an adequate or an adverse impact on the mangroves. And red mangroves do tend to be more temperamental to trimming, and they are not as hardy as some of the other species when it comes to trimming. So they do require a little bit more care, especially in the initial trimming cuts, to make sure that they aren't overly trimmed, as they don't do very well with that over trimming scenario. So with red mangroves, since they do have this mass of roots, sometimes it does become a little bit challenging to determine the, what is a root and what is a stem. So the stems typically have circular scars located on them, as you can see here on this lower image, and roots tend to be more smooth. And when you have mangroves with roots that grow way up towards the top portion of the trees, typically they don't make good candidates for height reduction. So these would be better candidates for windowing, which would be taking out lateral branches between the 6-foot and 12-foot mark, opening up a window for a view through the trees, as opposed to reducing them, since there is no foliage down here in the rooting area. So the earlier image that we looked at that showed the very manicured hedge, that's considered hedge trimming or height reduction trimming. And basically, if you have mangroves as seen on the left here, you have adequate foliage all the way distributed throughout the lower portion of the tree into the canopy of the tree. And those typically make pretty good candidates for height reduction. So they can typically be reduced in 1 or 2 cuttings down to the 6-foot height, depending on, how tall the trees are. But these trees on the right, as you can see, there's no foliage on the lower portion of the trees, and the only canopy remains up here. So if they were to reduce the trees to this dotted line here, they would effectively be removing all of the foliage and effectively killing the trees. So that would be something that our code would not allow them to do. So window trimming is the other type of trimming we typically see. And this would be, as we had seen in the other image as well, where they're reducing the lower portion of the mangroves. And typically this is shorter mangroves or younger mangroves that are recruiting in. And they reduce these to a 6-foot height. And then they open up this area in between the canopy, between the 6-foot and the 12-foot area, which opens it up for a view. And then everything from the above 12 feet is left for canopy, so that it does create quite an aesthetic trimming option for them. Leaving the canopy intact does leave some of the natural benefits of that canopy and natural functions of the canopy intact, and it does provide some roosting and so potentially some nesting habitat for birds as well. And it does preserve some of the mangrove function, and it still leaves some privacy for the property owners as well. So stage trimming is basically what we had shown in some of the exempt examples, where you're taking 25% trimming per year over a period of years to reduce mangroves that meet the criteria with adequate foliage on the lower portions of the tree to down to a 6-foot height to be maintained at that 6-foot height. Red mangroves oftentimes do not make good candidates for that unless they're very young trees, but and sometimes black mangroves, if they're older trees, they're not very good candidates for the height reduction, as they tend to have most of their canopies on the top portion of the tree with very little foliage in the center portion or lower portion of the tree. White mangroves and black mangroves do tend to be a little bit more resilient to trimming, so they do oftentimes make better candidates for the stage trimming than the red mangroves. And, with everything else, we do see some improper trimming on occasion, where people have decided to get, basically unsuited things to their mangroves. And this is considered lion's tailing, where they're basically removing foliage except for tiny little tufts at the top of the trees. And that basically takes away all of the photosynthesizing ability of the leaves, since the foliage is effectively removed from those trees. And another thing that we occasionally will see is when trees are trimmed from the ground to below the 6-foot height, and all of that lower foliage is removed, leaving these tiny little tufts at the top. And that again is not considered something that would be adequate and within our code. So we do have the opportunity to deal with violations if someone does improper mangrove trimming. And those violations are basically determined by the extent of deviation from the code and the potential of harm to the mangroves. And the potential of harm would take into consideration the area of the effective mangroves, the size of the trees that were impacted, which species of mangroves was impacted, and such. Also, we look at the extent of deviation from the code and what kind of trimming had occurred. Had they done alteration? Is there any kind of possibility for restoration? And were these trees in an area that was specifically protected, such as under a conservation easement, for example? And did the property owners have any kind of knowledge of what they were doing? Was it intended to be malicious, or was it something that they just moved here from out of state and really didn't understand that mangroves were protected? All of that is taken into consideration. Civil penalties can be assessed, and they can start anywhere from $100 up to $10,000 for the first offense, depending on the severity of the situation that has occurred.
Carol, we have a couple questions in the chat box about trimming.
Okay. Unfortunately, I've lost my chat box, so
I'm going to read it to you.
Perfect.
So Kim Millis wants to know, what's the right way for disposing of leaves and limbs that are trimmed? Do you just leave them where they fall, or is there a proper disposal?
They would need to be removed out of the wetland area, and they could basically be picked up with the trash or taken to, a dump site where you can take your tree debris.
Okay.
So typically they're taken off site though.
All right. Rita has a question.
Okay.
If a tree is not a good candidate, for instance, if the stress is too much, will the permit be denied?
It can be. We do field work, and we do assess the trees that people are looking to do permitting or permitted trimming on. We do go out and look at those sites, and if it's something that we feel what they're asking for is not going to work for that particular circumstance, we will either deny their application, or if there are some other opportunities for different types of trimming, we'll make suggestions as to what might work on that particular site as to some kind of trimming that they could potentially do.
If someone gets a permit for trimming, do you guys go back out afterwards to make sure they did it right?
Typically, permitted trimming is done with a professional mangrove trimmer, and we don't have the staff to go out and check all of those sites. Most of the time, they're very good at doing everything in accordance to the permit that they receive. Most of the time, if there is some kind of an issue, we do get calls from citizens, and that would trigger us to go out. Now, if it's a particularly difficult trimming situation or something that's very unique, in those circumstances, we will go back out after the trimming has occurred just to verify that everything was done in compliance with the permit.
Yeah. Nancy has a question about birds.
Okay.
Is there any consideration about not trimming when wading birds are nesting?
Yes, if we do go out to a site and discover that there is an active nest, then they do have to wait until the young have fled the nest before they are able to do any kind of trimming. So we would not allow any active trimming during the active nesting time.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So in addition to Pinellas County, there are a few other counties that do have delegation from the state for mangrove trimming, and their delegation allows them to tweak their code according to what they would like to accomplish. So some of them are a little bit stricter than Pinellas County, and others are very similar. So these are the different counties: Miami-Dade, Broward, Town of Jupiter Island, City of Sanibel, Hillsborough, and Sarasota counties that also have delegation from the state. So here's our contact information. If you would like to talk with me further, or anyone else on our staff, you're certainly welcome to give us a call. If you wanted to take a look at the website, it's www.pinellascounty.org/environmental/mangroves, and that will bring you directly to the mangrove page, and that will have that information on there. Additionally, we do have this Pinellas County Homeowners Guideline for Mangrove Trimming, which is a basic summary of the code, and it does, it's a little bit more user-friendly than the code, and it does tell you what qualifies for exempt trimming, what would require permits, and that is available upon request, since we currently don't have that on our website. They're hoping to get that back up pretty soon, but they had to take it off the website for ADA compliance consideration. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I got a question via email.
Okay.
Beverly Griffiths asked, can you talk a bit about mangrove flowers and their pollinators? I know you mentioned I saw a picture of one of the species that had some flowers. But if you can just talk about the 3 different species, if they flower, and what kind of pollinators frequent them.
Okay. Certainly. All 3 species do flower. The red mangroves have the least showy flowers, so they may not have as many frequent visitors, but there are a number of bees that do frequent the mangroves and do pollinate them. So the white and the black mangroves both have a white, small white flower, um, probably about as big as maybe one's thumbnail or so. And we regularly do see bees, um, and I believe they are the primary pollinator for the mangrove flowers. They do also have some people that harvest mangrove honey. So they do have set up their beekeeping in areas close to mangroves so that the bees can utilize the pollen from the mangroves, and then they can get mangrove honey from that, which is actually very tasty.
Great. Nancy had a follow-up question regarding birds.
Okay.
She's asking if the PMTs are aware of and considerate of nesting birds and the times of the year that they're nesting. Is this a part of their training? Are they made aware of, you know, when our nesting season for birds that would nest in mangroves?
We don't have any kind of a program where they would be made aware of that specifically, but I think most of the professional mangrove trimmers, if they are certified like through ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture, with they hold a certified arborist credential, then they have a lot of specific criteria to follow, and as such, they usually have to, you know, make sure they are doing everything, you know, in the proper ways. So I think most of those types of professional mangrove trimmers do hold themselves to a very high standard. And we have seen very few instances in the time that I've been doing this where there's been any kind of issues with birds nesting and having any kind of adverse impact by mangrove trimming. Typically, a lot of the fringes are fairly narrow that we see trimmed because of the nature of our county being so developed, that a lot of the areas where the birds do nest are a little bit more offshore on the mangrove islands, and those are protected from any kind of mangrove trimming.
Great, that's good to know. Deborah Rothenberger has a question about reestablishing mangroves by her seawall.
Okay.
Is there a program for that, or information for that, resources? Where would she turn to for help in doing that?
Well, I mean, if our staff could potentially give some guidance on that, depending on what the substrate was, what the water depths were, what kind of area her property was located on, if it's a high a lot of impact on the shoreline there, or if it's a low velocity type of shoreline where mangroves could potentially root. So if the area is exposed at low tide, then oftentimes, and that would be an area that mangroves could be planted. But if it is underwater, depending on how deep the water is, it may be limited as to whether mangroves could be directly planted there. But there could be an opportunity to maybe do like some riprap or something along that line. Riprap being some either broken concrete or natural limestone boulders that are placed on a 2-to-1 slope in front of the shoreline, and that could create an area where potentially some seeds could recruit into. You know, so there are some opportunities there that we could certainly look at possible enhancement, and those are typically site specific. There may be a little bit of information on the state DEP website, and as far as mangroves and where they can be planted and things like that. But we would certainly be happy to help her if she wanted to give us more specifics. We'd be happy to see if we could make some suggestions.
Thank you.
Certainly.
I don't see any more questions.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Carol, for that presentation. We appreciate you coming on and being one of our presenters. And if there are no further questions for the presenter, that is the end of our presentation for our meeting for tonight. And we will see all of the rest of you the first Wednesday of next month. Good night.
Well, thank you very much.